I'm not sure no one can talk after that. But you know, in the traditions of Thursday at 4, we exchange great ideas, we enjoy great art, and we think about what it means, and we ask the presenters and the performers about points that come to mind, issues that have arisen as we enjoy the performance or heard the discussion. So let's take a few minutes. Let me invite Michael Cherlin back up front. And thank our performers again for this gorgeous performance. And it's a reminder of the great musical talent that we enjoy in the Twin Cities. In the community, in our great ensembles, all of them have had experience in the Minnesota Orchestra or the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, and 5 of the 6 are in fact still playing in one or the other of those 2 orchestras, and the other retired after 23 years.
Oh, yeah.
I
don't know if I retired.
Well, on to other things.
I mean, yeah, okay.
All right, so the floor is open. Michael, why don't you feel? Is there comments or questions?
Please, yes. Could you say a little bit about the context of the premiere and the reaction, listeners' reaction?
Yeah. Well, early on, Schoenberg excited some controversy, and this is one of those pieces that confused people in the early hearings. This is a little earlier than I'm having trouble remembering the stories about the premiere of this piece. Some of the later pieces, when Schoenberg had already befriended Gustav Mahler, were kind of celebrated premieres, but I seem to recall that this was one of those troubled premieres. People didn't know what to make of it. There's one chord in the piece that hadn't been cataloged at the time.
That's right, the critics picked up on it.
Yeah, the critics picked up on it. Imagine that. Well, you can't use that chord. There's no name for it. And they made a whole hullabaloo over this particular chord. It's just one of those many gorgeous moments in the piece. It doesn't even stand out as a kind of odd moment to my ears. It's just another thing going on in the piece. So I don't really think about it much, but I know Schoenberg was played early on and late on and later on and always on. You know, he's a composer people love to hate until they come to love.
Michael, did he get any?
This is before he was affiliated with the Polish quartet. The first quartet, which is a little bit later than this, was the Rosé Quartet, and Arnold Rosé was the concertmaster of the Vienna Philharmonic. And if I recall, and I got to be cautious about this because I may not be recalling, members of that ensemble formed part of the ensemble that premiered this work.
And Rosé was the brother-in-law of Mahler.
Right, yeah. So there's all kinds of wonderful interconnections. Mahler was also going to be performed on Sunday, right? Mm-hmm. Mahler was one of the first champions of Schoenberg's music, and they had a wonderful relationship. It's very interesting because at first, young Schoenberg didn't care much for Mahler's music. He didn't think much of it. Then he heard a performance, I'm not going to remember the year, but he heard a performance of Mahler's Third Symphony that was just done here. He changed his mind, and he really changed his mind. And during Schoenberg's early career, Mahler literally helped pay the rent. Literally helped pay the rent. He was an amazing champion of this music. Mahler was there, I know, at the premiere of the first quartet, which was one of those occasions where all kinds of hullabaloo broke out. And he stood up and told the crowd, be quiet, let's listen to this music. It took great courage for him to do that. Of course, he was what a great musician he was, too. When Schoenberg wrote his harmony book, he dedicated it to Mahler. And by the time the second edition of that book came out, Mahler had passed away. And the dedication stood, but he called him a saint in that second dedication. So there's a great love and admiration of that younger composer for the older one. At this point in Schoenberg's career, however, there's no Mahler influence at all. He hadn't come to terms with Mahler yet, so that's not here. It's Brahms, it's Wagner, it may be a little bit of others, but there's no Mahler yet. That comes later.
Indirect answer to your question, when I got your program notes, at the very end, Schoenberg wrote himself, well, let's not forget the hissing, rioting that went on at the premiere. So
He didn't forget. Schoenberg didn't forget.
It was over here.
Yeah,
Susanna.
first of all, thank you so much. This is such a treat. And I have a question for the musicians. It's kind of a two-parter. First of all, when you have detailed program notes from the composer, such as there are for this piece, do you use them? And secondly, can you reflect on how that changes your approach to a piece, comparing this to, say, a quartet that you wouldn't have such notes for?
Well, I would say that if you have words from a composer, first of all, I'm actually not a huge fan of a lot of program notes, because, I don't know, I think that it's words and then there's music, so, the reason you're there is not to be involved in a non-literary endeavor, so it's mostly, unless you're doing song or something, but, so, if there are words, though, from a composer, I think they're very interesting. I want them to be there, because it does give you some little glimpse to their voice and, what they're coming from. So I think they are important, but, there's only so much space, so you have to be very careful.
Oh, I mean for your preparation.
Oh, for our
Yeah,
preparation? Well,
not us, for you guys.
Well, I have to make a total confession, which is, I remember in one of the rehearsals I said, I can't wait to hear what Michael says, because I can't remember which part of the poem applies to which part of the piece. Which, is, my mother is a musicologist and she'd be shocked that I was unprepared. But it was actually really nice to play the musical examples and then think about the imagery. And honestly, I think that it's all so well written into the music. I mean, I don't think I would have done anything differently knowing which parts related to which parts of the poem, which I think is, kudos to Schoenberg for being that expressive.
Let me chime in on this. I totally agree with what actually everybody's saying. I knew this piece for many, many years. I knew about the poem, I had read the poem, but I didn't take it that seriously. Okay, there's the poem, Schoenberg was inspired by the poem. But then when I, many years later, read Schoenberg's own works, it got me thinking about it afresh. I don't want you to go away thinking that I'm selling the idea that if you don't pay attention to this is the woman struggling with that, and this is the man saying that, and whatever, that you can't appreciate this piece. Because I don't think that's true at all. I think you can appreciate this piece as many ways as there are people that listen to it. I really believe that. And I think you can appreciate it with a deep knowledge of the leitmotifs as setting parts of the poem, or without any knowledge of it, to ignore it altogether if you prefer to just hear the beauty of the sounds. Schoenberg had faith, just as Katja said, that the music expresses what it wants to express, and that you don't need the words. But I do find it fascinating when there are these words, because of course poetry is another great art form, and when a piece is reacting to a poem and they interact in that way, I do find that fascinating. Another piece that I love from a very different kind of piece, from roughly the same period as I think 3 years earlier, is Debussy's Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, another gorgeous piece. How seriously should you take the Mallarmé poem that it's based on? Well, as seriously as you like. I've done a study of that wonderful poem, and correlated with the music is an amazing paraphrase of the poem. So if you want to go at it that way, it's amazing to go at it that way. But if you're not interested in meeting Mallarmé, you're just interested in hearing Debussy, that's fine too. So I think that goes for a lot of music. What fascinates me, I'll shut up in a second, about this business with Schoenberg is how closely, when he's working in this kind of idiom, how closely he really is following a story. He's really telling a story through the notes. And whether you know the story or not, in terms of the words, I'm not sure how important that is, but to my mind, it's clear that this is something that never went away for Schoenberg. So toward the end of his life, not at the very end, toward the end of his life, he wrote an absolutely gorgeous string trio, an amazing piece of music, very difficult to perform, sublime piece. And the piece is about a heart attack that he had had, a near-death experience. And we don't have words, but we know what happened to him, and we know he was depicting that. And it's so easy for me to imagine the psychological states that he's coming in and out of lucidity of consciousness and blacking out and all these kinds of things that are in the music. So again, if you want to hear it that way, fine. If you'd rather hear it as sound in motion, you know, that's also fine. Yeah.
I just want to return to the poem, and I also would like to thank the musicians and Michael for your wonderful exposition. You know, I was very struck that, and I'd be interested to hear you say a bit more, the word for stranger that comes up in the Demo poem is the word der Fremde, which is also the word for the foreigner. And thinking about at this moment, at the turn of the century, this notion of the foreigner is circulating. I mean, it's all over Schnitzler. It's everywhere. It is so very loaded. Is there a way when, if we shift our reading of the poem, regardless of how much we want, you know, going after what you just said, whether or not we want to see, the poem is intrinsic to the piece, but if we do shift it, to think about the ways in which the foreignness of this figure, can you speak to the way in which, how you would maybe want to integrate that into your earlier reading of the piece?
That's a beautiful question, and a non-trivial question, a difficult question in many ways. Look, Schoenberg is a Jew born in Vienna, a lot of Jews born in Vienna in those days. He thought of himself, or he wanted to think of himself, and there's a sea change that happens when Hitler comes to power. But he thought of himself as a German. You know, he thought of himself as Jewish, but as a German. He converted, and not to Catholicism, which would have been the power base to convert to. Mahler had to convert to Catholicism to hold a post in the opera. He couldn't have had that post. Non-Catholics need not apply at that time for that post. So he had to convert. Schoenberg didn't have to. He did, and then he reconverted to Judaism later on. Later on, during that period, in the 30s, he becomes particularly sensitive to this issue and says, I realize that I've always been, and the word he uses is an Oriental. That was in the jargon of the time that included Jews. I realize that I've always been an Oriental. I've always been feminine. I've always been an outsider. So I wonder how much it played all the time, if it's repressed and you know, comes to the surface and repressed. Yeah, it's a fascinating part of this, the inside the tradition, outside the tradition part of these figures. Mahler, it's in very different ways, but it's just as true for Mahler, maybe more so, even more so true for Mahler. The anti-Semites of the period heard something alien in this music. This is picking up on what you're saying. One of the attributes ascribed to Jews during this period was that they were rootless, not ruthless, R-O-O-T, rootless, as you say here in Minnesota. No roots. I find it amazingly ironic. Now, this was used when Schoenberg was appointed to the Academy in Berlin. This was used as a reason not to hire him. This argument. And I find it incredibly ironic that this is the man who voyaged outside of tonality so that we enter into a new world of music where it is rootless. It doesn't have a root anymore. It doesn't have a tonic stability anymore. So it's interesting. The anti-Semites were onto something. And they were despicable, but they were onto something in a remarkable way. Can I mention one other thing at the risk of outwearing my welcome that fascinates me about this piece? This is something I've been thinking about a lot here. Okay, so this is clearly a piece about eros, erotic. There's an erotic element to this piece, and the love is erotic, love. It's also a spiritual piece, and the transfiguration is a spiritual transfiguration. And that fusing together of romantic love, eros, eroticism, and spirituality is something that forms a thread through many, many religions, including Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, right? All of them have this aspect here and there throughout their religions. And the last time I studied this piece, 2 years ago, I had just finished reading a wonderful book, a very scholarly, not easy read, a book by Moshe Idel called Eros and Kabbalah. It was really fresh in my mind. And hearing and studying this piece, so Kabbalah is Jewish mysticism, and he's a great, great scholar, talks about the erotic elements in that mysticism that run like a thread through the whole history of Kabbalah. Schoenberg was not learned in mysticism, but he was interested in it. He was interested in it deeply. And I don't think this is a self-conscious link to that tradition, but I think it is a link. It happens to be in that same kind of world. We bring these things together. For me, that's very interesting. I mean, that's different from the erotics in Prelude to the Afternoon of the Faun. That's also a very erotic piece. But there's no spirituality. It's a gorgeous piece, don't get me wrong, I love the piece. But it's not, this is something else. This is like a reaching to something beyond. I think what goes on in the later music is that it's always reaching for something beyond, so that the notes that are there are pointing to notes that are not there. And the resolutions, the tonal resolutions that are missing are no longer attainable. You can't get there any longer. But it's always pointing into some other direction. His last work, on his deathbed that he was working on, was a collection of new psalms. You know, so he wanted, now this is a guy with some ego, right? He's writing, okay, the psalms are attributed to King David in the Bible. There are a bunch of them, right? They're all nice. Now Schoenberg will write his song with 12-tone music to boot. You know? So this is I think always with Schoenberg. In some sense, the composer as obeying God is important to this man. The way he thinks. Yeah.
They say in good German, es gibt eine Sperrstunde. We will have to vacate the room. You know, the other side of the coin